All these calculations assume that all the baby fruit flies and all the baby elephants make it successfully to adulthood. In theory, therefore, there must be an infinitely large supply of food and water to sustain this kind of reproductive overdrive. In reality, of course, those resources are limited, and not all baby fruit flies or baby elephants make it. There is competition among individuals within a species for those resources. What determines who wins the struggle for access to the resources? Darwin pointed out genetic variation means that some individuals have advantages in what he called the struggle for existence. To take the famous example of Darwin's finches from the Galapagos Islands, those individuals with genetic advantages, like the right size of beak for eating the most abundant seeds, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So the advantageous genetic variant, having a bill the right size, tends to be passed on to the next generation. The result is that natural selection enriches the next generation with a beneficial mutation, so that eventually, over enough generations, every member of the species ends up with that characteristic. The Victorians applied the same logic to humans. They looked around and were alarmed by what they saw. The decent, moral, hard-working middle classes were being massively out-reproduced by the dirty, immoral, lazy lower classes. The Victorians assumed that the virtues of decency, morality, and hard work ran in families just as the vices of filth, wantonness, and indolence did. Such characteristics must then be hereditary. Thus, to the Victorians, morality and immorality were merely two of Darwin's genetic variants. And if the great unwashed were out-reproducing the respectable classes, then the bad genes would be increasing in the human population. The species was doomed. Humans would gradually become more and more depraved as the immorality gene became more and more common. Francis Galton had good reason to pay special attention to Darwin's book, as the author was his cousin and friend. Darwin, some 13 years older, had provided guidance during Galton's rather rocky college experience. But it was the origin of species that would inspire Galton to start a social and genetic crusade that would ultimately have disastrous consequences. In 1883, a year after his cousin's death, Galton gave the movement a name: eugenics. Eugenics was only one of Galton's many interests. Galton enthusiasts refer to him as a polymath, detractors as a dilettante. In fact, he made significant contributions to geography, anthropology, psychology, genetics, meteorology, statistics, and by setting fingerprint analysis on a sound scientific footing, to criminology. Born in 1822 into a prosperous family, his education, partly in medicine and partly in mathematics, was mostly a chronicle of defeated expectations. The death of his father when he was 21 simultaneously freed him from paternal restraint and yielded a handsome inheritance. The young man duly took advantage of both. After a full 6 years of being what might be described today as a trust fund dropout, however, Galton settled down to become a productive member of the Victorian establishment. He made his name leading an expedition to a then little-known region of southwest Africa in 1850–52. In his account of his explorations, we encounter the first instance of the one strand that connects his many varied interests. He counted and measured everything. Galton was only happy when he could reduce a phenomenon to a set of numbers. At a missionary station, he encountered a striking specimen of steatopygia, a condition of particularly protuberant buttocks, common among the indigenous Nama women of the region, and realized that this woman was naturally endowed with the figure that was then fashionable in Europe. The only difference was that it required enormous and costly ingenuity on the part of European dressmakers to create the desired look for their clients. I profess to be a scientific man, and was exceedingly anxious to obtain accurate measurements of her shape. But there was a difficulty in doing this. I did not know a word of Hottentot, the Dutch name for the Nama, and could never, therefore, have explained to the lady what the object of my foot rule could be, and I really dared not ask my worthy missionary host to interpret for me. I therefore felt in a dilemma as I gazed at her form, that gift of bounteous nature to this favored race, which no mantua maker with all her crinoline and stuffing can do otherwise than humbly imitate. The object of my admiration stood under a tree, and was turning herself about to all points of the compass, as ladies who wish to be admired usually do. Of a sudden, my eye fell upon my sextant. The bright thought struck me, and I took a series of observations upon her figure in every direction, up and down, crossways, diagonally, and so forth, and I registered them carefully upon an outline drawing for fear of any mistake. This being done, I boldly pulled out my measuring tape and measured the distance from where I was to the place she stood, and having thus obtained both base and angles, I worked out the results by trigonometry and logarithms. Galton's passion for quantification resulted in his developing many of the fundamental principles of modern statistics. It also yielded some clever observations. For example, he tested the efficacy of prayer. He figured that if prayer worked, those most prayed for should be at an advantage. To test the hypothesis, he studied the longevity of British monarchs. Every Sunday, congregations in the Church of England, following the Book of Common Prayer, beseeched God to endue the King Queen plenteously with heavenly gifts, grant him her, in health and wealth, long to live. Well, surely, Galton reasoned, the cumulative effect of all those prayers should be beneficial. In fact, prayer seemed ineffectual. He found that on average the monarchs died somewhat younger than other members of the British aristocracy. Because of the Darwin connection, their common grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, too, was one of the intellectual giants of his day. Galton was especially sensitive to the way in which certain lineages seemed to spawn disproportionately large numbers of prominent and successful people. In 1869, he published what would become the underpinning of all his ideas on eugenics, a treatise called Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into its laws and consequences. In it, he purported to show that talent, like simple genetic traits such as the Habsburg lip, does indeed run in families. He recounted, for example, how some families had produced generation after generation of judges. His analysis largely neglected to take into account the effect of the environment. The son of a prominent judge is, after all, rather more likely to become a judge by virtue of his father's connections, if nothing else.